Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks all for being here. I'm Ashley Sklar, the Adult Services and Community Engagement Consultant with the Connecticut State Library, Division of Library Development. And together with my colleague, Kim Poe, our Children and Young Adult Consultant, we're pleased to bring you more Growing Equitable Library Services, or GELS. You can find lots more about GELS, past work, and maybe even some previews of what's to come on our LibGuide. We'll drop that link for you. And today we're here for part 3 of our series with Dr. Audrey Barbakoff, this one called Transformational Changes. Audrey is the CEO of CoLab Capacity, which provides community-centered consulting for libraries and social good organizations. She has more than a decade of experience in public libraries, and you can find lots more about Audrey and her background on our LibGuide. I will say that she is the author of the forthcoming book, 12 Steps to a Community-Led Library, just because it is our topic for this series. So you'll find that coming later this year. Just some housekeeping things before I turn it over to her. Excuse me, Zoom offers live captioning feature, and you have the ability to adjust that as needed in the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can turn it on, you can turn it off now, during the program, whatever you like. We are recording today's session, as you probably noted, and the slides are actually already available on the LibGuide. And once we have the recording, that will go up there as well for you. Kim and I will be here with you, keeping an eye on the chat throughout. So add your questions, chime in, add your comments, your insights. We like activity in there. So last, we will be following up at the end of the session, as we always do, with a survey. So take a moment, share your feedback. We love to hear your input, what you'd like from GELS, what you'd like to see, what you thought. So take a moment, we appreciate it, and we do read them all. And with that, I will just turn it over to Audrey to get us started. Thanks, Audrey.
Thanks, Ashley. And thanks both Ashley and Kim for having me back to talk about one of my favorite topics in the world. So I'm so excited to be here and to be able to share all of this with you, and to be able to learn from you as well. We're going to do a lot of discussing today. So please do use the chat liberally. I will keep an eye on it. If you have questions throughout, just pop them in. If there's something I can respond to in the moment, I will try to do that. Ashley or Kim might interrupt and say, hey, if I missed something. And for longer questions, we'll keep track of those and hold them to the end. So please do feel free to chime in throughout. So what are we going to do for the next 90-ish minutes? We're going to take a little bit of a dive back into some of the fundamentals and just give an overview, since this is a series, to give you some grounding so that if you did not come to previous series, or, if you've maybe had something to do, 1 or 2 things to focus on in between then and now, that you're feeling rooted and grounded in the principles that underlie what we're going to talk about. Then we're going to really focus today on the core of the changes that we can make in our organization to increase our capacity to do community-led planning, community-led work. And then we'll take some time to do some reflecting, and then also to look ahead and see what we'll talk about in the final installment of the series. Any questions before we get rolling? All right. So this is the largest phase of the model, so we're not gonna spend a lot of time on the recap. But as just a basis, what is community-led plan? It is a mindset and a method for redistributing power back to your community. So if you came to any of the previous sessions, we looked at the IAP2 spectrum of public participation, which looks at the different ways libraries engage with and interact with their communities, moving from informing, right, one-way communication, here's what's going on, important but unidirectional, to kind of a middle phase of consulting or asking for input, where we solicit opinions from the community, where we ask them what they want or what they need, but then we hold on to all the power to make the decision. Community-led work lives in your highest levels of engagement, where power is either equally shared between the library and the community, or the library gives over the majority of power to the community. Where we support, we provide resources, we provide expertise, but it is the goals of the community that matter. Members of the community or our partners have actual authority to make final decisions about what success looks like, what activities or actions are going to take place, right, and how we're going to get there. So fundamentally, that's what community-led planning is. And you can apply this ethos in a variety of different types of planning, right? You can use this to develop programming. You can use it to create your strategic plan. You can use it to help inform how you're going to design a space. So you can apply it in a lot of different situations. Some of the core reasons that you might choose to use community-led planning, primarily it is a method for putting our DEI values into action. Right? When the communities that when we are intentional about sharing power with communities that have been systematically denied access to power and resources, then we are working as a force for equity in our community. Right? We are rebalancing the scales and breaking down systems of oppression and disempowerment. So it's really important when we do community-led planning that we're very intentional about thinking about who is impacted most by the decisions that are being made, who is not being heard, whose voice has been traditionally systematically excluded, and making sure that we are being very conscious about engaging with, building trust and relationships with, and then centering folks from that community so that they have real power to shape the future of the library. There are also some other more practical benefits, right? Less kind of lofty values based, but there's some concrete benefits as well. When we use community-led planning methods, our decisions and services become immensely relevant to the community, and they know it, right? Because we're not out there with our sheet of paper that's like, here's a list of 3,000 different things that we do and offer that we wish you would remember and that you should all know about. I was recently actually just earlier this week, you know, I was working with a library, and they were talking about some facilities planning that they'd been doing, and they said, you know, gosh, we had these open town halls, and it was so hard to listen because when we asked people what they wanted, 75% of what they said were things we were already doing, and they just don't know, right? Like, it's so frustrating. But people don't remember, right? Because we just present them with these big long lists of like, here's all the stuff. And there's so many things that we do, but it's like, if it's not relevant to you right in that moment, it just doesn't stick, right? People just don't remember. So when we're doing community-led planning, we are not the ones coming up with the service or the idea or the program or the collection, right? We're out there in the community as part of perhaps like projects or initiatives that are already happening, goals that people are already working towards, and we're just there as part of their support, bringing our resources to bear on the things they already care about and they're already doing. So we don't have to tell them like, we're relevant and we have all this stuff. They see us being relevant, right? We are there offering the things that are most helpful to them at the moment that is most helpful to them. So that means that our services are extraordinarily relevant and impactful to, you know, to achieving community goals. And the people we're working with are like, oh, like the library is rocking it, right? They see why we matter. Community-led planning is a team sport. It's not something that you can do by yourself. So just by nature, you're going to build relationships. And those relationships are the core of everything that we do, right? Whatever decisions you make, it's those relationships that are going to make them successful in the real world, right? That are going to take things sort of off the piece of paper. So you build relationships by going through this process just as a natural outcropping of what you're doing. And it expands your resources, right? You're working in partnerships, in coalitions, in groups. So that means you're drawing on a bigger pool of funding, of staff time, and of expertise, right? So you have all of these things in complementary ways that can be shared. So what that does is now those foundations take us into the collab model. And this developed out of my research, looking into how do we actually make changes in our libraries to support community-led planning. The basics of community-led planning have been around for like 20 years, right? And that's even just like specific to libraries. A lot of the underlying ideas have been around much longer. So knowing the steps, kind of like knowing the what, is not enough, right? what I found is we really need to build our library's capacity to be able to apply these steps, right? So that we're changing our cultures and our systems so that this isn't like a tacked on extra way that we might try to do some things, but that we're shifting our culture so that we think about our work in a community-led way. Right? And that's what really builds our capacity. That's what allows this kind of work to stick and not just kind of be a novelty, like an extra thing that you're trying to do on top of all your real normal work. Leadership plays a key role, but individuals do as well. So everyone can really make a difference. And throughout, I'm going to talk about the different ways that managers and individual contributors might each contribute to an idea in kind of a different way, like the ways that they can impact. So what that model actually looks like is it's a three-phase change model with 12 steps. We've talked about the inspirational change phase, and today we're talking about transformational, which is essentially transforming culture, right? It's what we need to change in the deeply embedded processes and characteristics of the organization. And it's frankly where the real work is. People are always tempted to jump right to operational, which is like changing how we do things day to day. And we are not really going to get into that today. That's going to be the next piece, because if we make those operational changes and we haven't made the underlying culture change, the operational changes don't stick. They're not sustainable because they're not rooted in anything. They don't mean anything to anyone. They feel arbitrary, right? So the work now of like shifting culture, even though that might seem indirect, this is actually the real meat of the work. This is the stuff that's going to reshape your organizations in ways that make community-led work really possible within your capacity, right? Or whatever kind of size or budget or library type you have. So as a refresh, the steps in inspirational change were for the organization to prioritize and be accountable for DEI. To focus training and education on concepts rather than procedures. So less of you do community-led planning by doing step 1, step 2, step 3, and more of giving people a grounding in the principles of public participation, of trauma-informed service, of racial equity, of disability justice, right? Giving people access to these bigger concepts so that they are able to attach those specific steps to meaningful core values, so that people are able to see, right, how doing this step is influencing our values, because the steps are going to change, right? Every community-led program, service, planning process is a little bit different because your community is always a little different, right? Everyone's community is unique. Every moment in time is unique. Every project is unique. So the steps will always kind of change around. But if you're able to have a clear sense of why, like what you're trying to accomplish, how what you're doing is really related to key goals, then you're able to be flexible in the how. So the third step is then to be explicit about making those connections, is to talk about how connecting, like how the work you're doing is bringing your DEI values to life, how the work that you're doing is helping the community advance its own goals. Okay, that's a lot of me yakking. We're going to take a few minutes and hear from you. So we're going to break into breakout rooms. And again, Kim and Ashley, let's do like 4 to 5-ish people in a room. I know that some of you may not be able to speak in breakout rooms. Maybe you're on the desk or you're in a place, you don't have a camera or a microphone where you are, for whatever reason, you may be kind of in listen only mode. That's fine. We're going to use breakout rooms throughout because that's important to helping us take the kind of conceptual things we're talking about and apply them in our own libraries, or start to think about how we'd apply them in our own libraries. So even if you're only able to listen, I think hearing other libraries talk about application is so really enriching. And we're going to make the groups big enough that hopefully there's at least 2 or 3 of you in each group who can talk, so you're just not sitting there by yourself. So, okay, that's the disclaimer about breakout rooms all throughout, is participate if you can, it's fine if you can't, just listen. So the discussion question here is just to, again, kind of get us rooted. So if you came to part 1 and or part 2, share with your group what's a takeaway that you had from that session. Like, what's an idea that has continued to stick with you, or maybe even that you've been able to start putting into practice. If you didn't attend part 1 or part 2, that's totally fine. Just reflect on what you heard in this brief, pretty fast recap. What's an idea that catches your attention from what you've just heard, or an idea that's, that you want to spend some more time with? So those are your discussion questions. Let's go into breakout rooms and just take about 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. Kim and Ashley, do we have everyone now, or are there still people in rooms? Okay, cool. I'm never sure if like that people are just filtering in, or if that like 60-second period has ended. Excellent. Well, would anyone like to share a takeaway, something that you discussed in your group, whether from you or whether something that someone else said that really resonated with you? Feel free to speak up or to put some thoughts in the chat. Well, I'll share something that I heard as I was lurking in a few of the rooms. I heard someone talk about how work in libraries is so often project-based. I thought that was a really interesting insight, because it's a key difference between sort of library-led work and community-led work. Not that we don't do projects, but that community-led work is really fundamentally relationship-based, right? And it's really moving that focus away from like spending all our time on projects and like on kind of like, let's do this thing, and very kind of deliverable oriented, and carving out a fairly significant amount of our time to be relationship building, right? And to be relationship oriented. So I thought that was an interesting distinction.
And Doug, did I see you unmute? Not to call you out, but I thought I saw Doug unmute himself, and then I see Scott unmuted.
It was pretty much the same thing. It was that the iterative process is very important, and that, yes, it is nice to think librarians tend to be very project-based. Like, we did this once, and now it's time to put that away, but that is just never going to be the case. It's important to be always re-upping and always reiterative and always, even to the point of over-inclusion, but inclusion. That's all.
Thanks, Doug. Scott, go ahead.
Sure, and sharing what Becky has put in the chat, she was in my group from Slater Library, about baby steps, or taking it a step at a time and not trying to do everything all at the same, everything all at once. Academy Award winning movie. So you want to make sure that you're doing it correctly is a good thing. Ava, who was also in our group, is a board of trustees member, and really iterated how it's important to do surveys, to do all this in a process, as opposed to, because it can feel really daunting, even because, like, for example, my library doesn't necessarily have a DEI right in place. It's not something that a lot of libraries have exactly in place, all set to go. So it is that process, and that really was a great thing that came out of our discussion.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. And absolutely, I really want to reinforce that like, I'm giving you 12 things, right, between these 4 webinars that libraries can do. You can do all 12, or you can do one, right? Like, take those steps where you can take them, and it makes a difference. It really does. Some other things I'm seeing in the chat. How to share power with community groups or activists that can build networks and relationships and sustain them. Absolutely. And to go back to the point we just heard verbally, I think that when we invest consistently in those relationships and being part of those networks, then when we have kind of the project, it's a little less daunting, right? It's like, we're not starting from nothing. We have people we can go to and say, hey, participate, we're doing a thing with focus groups and surveys, and like, but you already have people who are part, that can be part of that process, or that you already have context. So that really helps. Flexibility is key. Don't hold on to assumptions of what the community needs. Take time to listen to what they need. Absolutely. Fantastic. And one more comment, I often think of relationships as the outcome, and I might be quoting Audrey there. Absolutely, yes. The process is the product, the relationship is the deliverable. Yeah. Absolutely. That the thing that we make is time limited, right? Like, whatever you plan is going to last for a set amount of time. Maybe it's a fairly long time if you're like designing a physical building, right? But it's still a project, right? But the relationship continues. So really, we're conditioned really, like we're set up to think about the thing as the outcome. But if we think about the thing as kind of what gets us to a deeper relationship, I think that really flips our thinking around. And one more comment, also good to check with other librarian colleagues who may have advice or who have gone through the process. Absolutely, those internal communities are very important for us as well. Yeah. Excellent. Well, with that foundation in place, we're going to start talking about the 6 steps in the transformational phase. They are foster a growth mindset, develop psychological safety for a culture of inclusion and innovation, make time for reflection, hire and train for interpersonal skills and cultural humility, connect prior experience, and build community knowledge through relationships. So let's dive into those one at a time. Well, we're actually going to do 2 at a time. Let's dive in 2 at a time. But first, we're going to talk about growth mindset. So growth mindset is a concept that was pioneered by Carol Dweck. I want to say maybe in like the 80s or the 90s. She has a really great book called Mindset. Quick read, highly recommend. But essentially, a growth mindset, as opposed to a fixed mindset, is the idea that our abilities can be increased with effort. Right. And that's basically all. That if we keep working at something, if we give it attention and we nurture it, we're going to get better at it. And a fixed mindset is kind of this idea that like all of our abilities are innate, right? You're smart or you're not, good at sports or you're not, right? You're good at, you can play musical instruments well or you can't, right? These kind of, these fixed mindsets. And those have enormous impacts on how we show up throughout our lives, but especially in the workplace. And then the idea was initially applied to in the education sphere for kids, but excellent. Anytime I talk about a concept, Kim or Ashley pops in the chat like, Jill's already did a webinar that's completely about that. So if you did reimagining school readiness, you've talked a lot about growth mindset. Excellent. There's a lot more. I won't go too much into detail, but essentially research really backs up that perception is reality. Like growth mindset is true. If you really believe that you can, that you can learn and you can improve, then you will invest in learning and improving, and you will learn and improve. That if you hold a growth mindset, you really do get better at things. And if you hold a fixed mindset, you tend to spend more time being defensive and protective, right? Because any kind of failure is just proof that your innate abilities weren't good enough to begin with, right? So it makes people very afraid to try new things. So we really want to foster a growth mindset. When I talk to librarians, I was doing my original research, and I talked to librarians who were really doing a lot of successful, interesting community-led work from libraries of all different sizes and all around the country. I started out, what I wanted to find out about was kind of their self-efficacy, their confidence, right? It was like, how well do they think they could do this when they started? And I was kind of surprised to hear from the beginning, all of them were like, I had no idea how to do this. Not a clue. I was terrible at the beginning. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. We ended up hosting turning this into a program that was all about square dancing, and I've never danced in my life. Like, I don't know how to do the thing. I don't know how to plan, how to co-design or plan. Like, people really came in with no knowledge and pretty much no confidence. One person sort of said, like, if you'd asked me my confidence out of 10, I would have said 2 or 3 in the beginning. That they really, didn't feel like they knew everything when they started. They just believed that the work was really important, and they trusted that they would get better as they went along. And by they, I mean both themselves as individuals, and they trusted the people that they were working with, this kind of collective efficacy, their colleagues and their partners. They were like, we're going to learn together. We're going to figure this out together. Even if I don't get it all right, I'm working with a lot of brilliant people here, and they're going to get that part right. So this growth mindset, this feeling of like, we're going to dive in because it matters, and it's okay that we don't know everything, and it's okay that we're not perfect, and it's okay that we're going to make mistakes, because we're going to learn, and by the end, we're going to be freaking off, right? So when we move into community-led work, this is a new way of working for a lot of libraries. It's not our standard default operating procedure. And it requires new skills and new knowledge, and that makes it a leap of faith, right? You have to start before you are confident and comfortable and before you feel like you know everything, because you can't know everything until you do it. Right? And what is it, like that Aristotle quote, like the more I know, the more I realize I know nothing. It's like, once you do community-led work, you'll realize there's no end. There's no moment where you're like, well, I know how to do this, because community is always changing, right? So you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be good at everything. You just have to be confident in your ability to learn. So what are some strategies for fostering a growth mindset? And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about like both managers and individual contributors. So one of the easiest, like really simple, but surprisingly effective ways to encourage a growth mindset is just to tell people to have a growth mindset. It's called priming. But just start people off with like, remember that you're trying something new. It won't be perfect. And this is something you can get better at. You can learn this. Right? There's a lot of research that shows like, a lot of this is done with kids in a school situation. But if you tell people like this test is measuring your intelligence, your innate intelligence, versus like, this is something that you'll get better at as you do it again and again. Right? Like it makes a huge difference. Just like giving them a couple of sentences up front, like setting them up to think in a growth mind, like to have a growth mindset perspective, makes enormous differences in their performance. So this is measurable. So even in your own, you're obviously, we're not talking about standardized testing or anything here, but if you just remind yourself and others that you're going to learn and get better, and that you might make mistakes, and that's okay, that is incredibly helpful. So if you are a manager, you can do this in kind of like a formal way, right? Like you can put this on, you can start off your meetings by saying things like this, right? But for anyone, really mentoring, right? Saying it to yourself, and then also being there to be this mentoring voice for others, saying like, you can learn, you're going to be awesome at this, right? You're going to get better as we do it. So doing that for ourselves and doing it for others. Managers might be able to do it formally, but everyone can do it informally. So related to this is normalizing learning from failure, right? And I've seen things, I don't know where to attribute this to, but I've just seen it like floating around that FAIL stands for first attempt in learning, right? You need to make it okay to fail, because we're going to mess up, or we're going to have things where we don't know. So what's important is that we discuss failure and we learn from it. Like, for example, I'm noticing that I misspelled the word discuss here, and I'm going to learn from that and fix it after this webinar. But no, that we take time to like, we make it okay to fail, that it's not like you're not going to be punished, right? There's not going to be negative repercussions for your job. That it's not going to like impact that you won't get a project next time, but that failure is expected because you're taking risks and learning new things. So of course we don't know everything yet. That we take the time to process that failure. That's what really makes it different. Like that's what makes a difference, right? Is that it's not just something we're ashamed of and we tuck away, but we learn from it. We say, okay, why did that fail? In what ways did that fail? And what did I learn from that I can apply in the future? Right? If you've messed up in a way that requires repair, right, this can often happen, especially when we're working in very cross-cultural environments, right? If the librarian is who holds a different identity, a really different set of lived experiences than the partners or the community members that you're working with, like you can slip up, you can say something that hurts someone, right? And which I'm going to assume is, that you're doing it unintentionally, but you might need to do some repair there. So recognizing when that's needed, and then making the repair. Like you don't have to make a huge thing about it necessarily, but taking those steps and trying again. So for what a manager can do that's really powerful here is making your own failures public. First of all, allow yourself to fail in public, right? When something doesn't work out, don't hide it from your team. Model the way, right? say, hey, you know, I tried this. It didn't work the way I was imagining that it would, or that I intended it to. And let's debrief it. Let's talk about, you know, what I could have done differently, what I might do better next time, you know, what if any steps need to be taken for repair. So as a manager, when you do that, then your team knows that it's a safe space for them to do that, right? That like that's one of the best things you can do to make it safe for them. But also make sure that you're giving your team a lot of space for this, both as a group and as individuals, right? When you're in a one-on-one meeting with someone and they're like, oh, I'm doing this thing and it's this project and it's really like, I went to this last meeting and the vibe was really weird and like things just don't seem like they're going well, you know, help them talk through it. Don't be punitive about it, right? Or like set ultimatums. But if you're here in this webinar, you're probably not that kind of manager, but you know, really give them space to learn and help them, right? Help them do that. We all have a lot of baked in fear of failure, right? Even if it's never, like, even if you as a manager have never imposed that on your team, we come in with that a lot of times from our life experiences, right? So like, it's scary to fail, especially to fail in front of someone who has some kind of power over you and your livelihood. So really nurturing a space to have those conversations with people, kind of helping draw them out, helping them learn from those experiences in a way that's really supportive, that makes a huge difference. But you also don't have to be a manager to help normalize learning from failure. First of all, is addressing that innate fear in yourself, right? And there's a tool that I enjoy for this called failure resumes, where you make a resume, but instead of all of the accomplishments, right? You know, normally in a resume, you list kind of all of your big accomplishments. Instead, you're going to list a bunch of your really big failures. And what goes underneath that is what you learned, right? And how you changed as a result. So it's kind of a way of actually documenting and like writing down for yourself, like, what are some times that I failed? And first of all, like, I didn't die because I'm here writing this failure resume right now. So it was okay. Like, things worked out. And, you know, it really makes you put down in black and white, like on paper, right? Here's something where I failed and here's something that I learned. And here's how it made me better. So that's just a tool you can use to kind of like address your own hangups or fears about failure. And if you're a part of a team, even if you're not leading that team, the more, if you feel safe to do so, but like the more you can talk about your failures in a really upfront way and like ask people for advice and explain what you're learning, right? Like the more you can model that, that also helps create a safe space for your team. Or even if you can't do it in your formal team, like find some allies in your organization that you can do that with, right? Like find a fail buddy, you know, who can help you process. Finally, support open channels of communication. So the more voices that are contributing ideas and giving feedback, the more we're learning, right? We don't need to be defensive against ideas that are different from ours or that are coming from unusual quarters. Right, a lot of times in libraries, especially if your library is a little bit bigger, it's very easy to end up with a lot of silos or a lot of kind of like divisions between kind of, you know, whose voice is important based on, you know, maybe who has an MLAS or who's in a professional versus a paraprofessional role or a full-time versus a part-time role. But when we embrace a growth mindset, it's all about learning. Right? It's all about learning from every source. So we want to learn from every source that we can and every perspective that we can. And we don't need to put up a lot of barriers to kind of protect our sense that we're important. Right? So we can really open up channels of communication, get ideas from all sides, get feedback from all sides. You might get perspectives about why something is successful or why something isn't working that you wouldn't have gotten from the same people who are all normally in the room having the same conversation. Right? So the more voices that are involved, just the richer the work and the organization is, right? And the more the organization as a whole benefits. I'm going to move into the next step, and then we'll talk about both of these. And this is these two are very closely related. So in my research, I found that for libraries to have a really high capacity for community-led planning, they really need a culture of inclusive innovation. So a culture where people can bring forward ideas and fail and try stuff and do new things and go out on a limb, and that's encouraged, right? And it's supported. And if you go out on a limb and the limb breaks, it's okay, right? But and the inclusive piece of that is that you only really have a culture of innovation if everyone feels that way, regardless of their identity, right? Regardless of their job title. And I did see this in many situations where, like, in some cases, people would feel like, well, I'm not really empowered to contribute because I'm just, quote unquote, a paraprofessional, or, you know, in a certain role. Or people who would say, look, my job title says that I can do this. But frankly, you know, I'm the only BIPOC staff member. And I don't feel like people really want to hear what I have to say. Like, people don't, my opinion is seen as disruptive, right? And like, so even though my title is right, I don't actually feel like I'm being, you know, given the personal agency and the personal safety to do this. And it's very unfortunate that the people, right, and not accidental, but very unfortunate that the people who often feel the most excluded and the least able to share as a result of their identity are the people in our communities that we most want to be centering and hearing from, right? Like the people that we say our work should really be focused on. When we have folks on our staff with those identities, they're often very marginalized, both because, you know, either because of their position or because of their identity. So making sure that we have inclusion so that everyone can innovate. Okay, so how do we get there? How do we get to this culture where like everyone can contribute and everyone can share ideas and run with them and, you know, bring in their perspectives and their lived experiences and their networks and like all these wonderful things, right? What we need to get there is psychological safety. And this is a concept that comes from researcher Amy C. Edmondson, who I want to say is based at Harvard, but I'm not 100% positive about that. And her book, well, she's got several, but the one I really love is called Fearless Organization. She also has a couple of TED Talks floating around you can find. So community-led planning needs this culture of inclusion and innovation. Inclusion and innovation needs psychological safety. Psychological safety broadly is the feeling that you will not be judged or punished, right, for speaking up. And there are a few dimensions of psychological safety. So there's inclusion safety, like feeling that you won't be judged and punished because of who you are, right? That you're accepted for you, for all of you, right? For your authentic self. There's also contributor safety, which means that not just can you like, you're not just accepted for being yourself, but you can speak up, right? You can contribute ideas, even if they're different from the status quo, right? Even if they're seen as challenging, right? Or difficult or different, that you can speak up, you know, with your ideas without fear. That you can learn, that it's okay to not know, that it's okay to ask questions. So that's learner safety. And then there is the safety to make mistakes, or challenge the status quo, challenger safety. So contributor safety and challenger safety are related, but basically contributor safety is about, I can speak up, right? I can put in my 2 cents, whatever that is. And then challenger safety is specifically about within that, the piece of like, I can say something that is going to rock the boat a lot. Like, I can say something that's really contrary to what we're doing right now, or that's, you know, that would require like a lot of change, or that's critical, right? That's critical of the organization. So how do we develop psychological safety? I will say like this is basically what the book Fearless Organizations is about, and there's a whole there's trainings around how to do this. So this is like a very brief overview of how to create psychological safety. Number 1, make failure okay. Doesn't that sound familiar? I feel like we've talked about that. Right. Okay. So it's really that important. Like, it's so important to many of these steps. So, you know, again, make failure okay. And value lived experience. So really, you know, we talk a lot about DEI with an external focus, right? Like how are we going to include marginalized and excluded communities? How are we going to center BIPOC and LGBTQ communities? And how are we going to lift up excluded voices? But we need to do that on the inside too. We have to do that within our staff, or we're not going to be able to do it with the public. Right? We really need to value lived experience. Welcome everyone on your staff for who they are and the unique perspective that they bring. Right? Internally, look at dismantling biases and inequitable systems. And a really simple thing here is just to show appreciation for each individual, right? Everyone wants to know that they're seen and valued. So part of creating that inclusion, psychological safety, right, is just letting people know that you see them and you value them. And you can do that as a manager in like, a formal way. And you can just do that as a peer. Like that thing you did, that was super cool, right? Hey, like your sense of humor, right, in meetings, or just kind of, showing people appreciation for who they are and what they bring. And also wanting to include their voice, right? If you really value someone's experience, you want to hear what they have to say. So asking for, soliciting their opinion, right? And involving them in decisions. Make it safe to speak up. So when someone shares a divergent or challenging idea, don't get defensive, don't shut them down, right? And make a safe space for that idea to get shared. Again, this is one of those things that, like, as a manager, people are watching how you do this and determining if it is safe for them to do the same thing. So this is really critical if you're a manager, that when someone shares a divergent or challenging idea, that you hear it, and don't immediately kind of jump to like, no, here's all the reasons we don't do it that way, or here's why that can't happen, or you're a problem, right? But just hearing it and taking it in. You don't have to respond right away. You don't have to have a solution right away, but just really making sure it's heard. Of course, you can also help support this as an individual, right? Be someone who people can come to and share a difficult idea, and stand by them when they share it more broadly. Right? So you can do this just with each other. And finally, welcome new ideas from all sources. If you're a manager, you want to do this systematically, right? You can like set, not just sort of a like, I have an open door, everyone's voice is welcome, very kind of passive, right, form of hearing all voices, but actively welcoming ideas. So you can set up processes, right, that solicit ideas from all corners. Like you can have a formal, like, hey, I have an idea. What are the steps that I take to make sure that this gets heard by someone in leadership, right? And like make sure people know that their contributions are welcome and that there's a process, right? Like there's a way that they can actually be heard, right? Make sure everyone is aware that, of what these processes are and how to use them. And then when people do bring ideas forward, respond to them publicly, quickly, transparently, right? I mean, publicly if it is appropriate to do so, but like let it be seen that you're doing this, right? That you want to hear from people, that you're seriously considering ideas that come your way. Doesn't mean you'll be able to do everything. There might be other elements that someone's not aware of, right? And we all sort of see a different piece of the elephant in our jobs. But if something's not moving forward, communicating the why, right? Like let people see you really wanting to hear from them. As individuals, you can just publicly invite others in, right? You can say, while you're having a discussion about something, you can be like, actually, Kim, I think knows a lot about this, even though she works in a different department. Can we bring her in? Like, can we have this conversation with her before we, have another meeting where she's invited before we make this decision? So like speaking up about bringing in other voices, every individual can do that, right? And I want to highlight something that happened in the chat. So in terms of safety and speaking up, someone has said, I like to say, tell me more when someone's sharing a new idea. And I'm seeing lots of kind of like thumbs up and encouragement around that. So that's like that's a real simple, great strategy, right? Someone comes up with an idea and internally your first reaction is like, whoa, like, whoa, that's scary, or whoa, that's hard, or like, whoa, that's going to open up a whole can of worms. Sort of like have that reaction on the inside and say, tell me more. Yeah, tell me more about that idea. Thank you, Kathy. That's a great suggestion. So now let's hear more of those great suggestions. We're going to go back into breakout room. And here are some questions to discuss. To say, do you have more of a growth or a fixed mindset about community-led work right now? How can you encourage yourself or those around you to believe in your ability to learn as you go? How psychologically safe do you feel on your team and in your library, right? Psychological safety is not like one size fits all. You can sort of feel really safe in your team and not so safe in your broader organization, for example. So in what ways do you feel safe, right? Inclusion, contributor, learner, challenger. How might you increase psychological safety within your team or your organization? Another question, How does your organizational culture treat failure? How about you personally? Right? And what steps might you take? So feel free to dive into any or all of these that kind of resonate with you and your experience. And let's take 8 minutes for this one. Take us right to noon. Excellent. So who would like to share something that came up in your group?
Scott, are you unmuted because you want to share, or should I?
Oh, no, I'm probably unmuted because I'm just unmuted. Yeah, but I'll share because I'm here. And yeah. Well, no, it was a lovely conversation because I think one thing that came up was Erica was in our group and she's a new mom. And so that talking about failure and feeling fair. And Erica, I'll let you tell your own story, but she said how she read every book about having the baby, but no books about being a mom. So that's a problem. And so, but she brought up this whole concept of mistake and repair. And letting the failure happen and owning that failure. And that kind of became a key of what we all talked about.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, it was just another book that I'm reading. I was just connecting two parts of my life, right? Called Brain Body Parenting, that was talking all about the neuroscience of how little brains grow. And there's this sort of optimal area of optimally challenged and, able to make mistakes, both on the parents' end and on the kids' end. And it's super powerful. And I don't know, I just had this moment where I was like, oh my God, this is the same thing. Our brains are still our brains, even when we're not toddlers. It's so true.
I love that. And I agree there are so many parallels between the things that we learn raising children and the things, the lessons we can bring to our library. I really appreciate that observation. All right, let's jump ahead to the next couple. So, spoiler alert, this particular step has influenced why we're spending time in breakout rooms in this webinar, but making time and space for reflection. Relationship-based work, right? Community-led work is relationship-based work. We're working with people who have different lived experiences, different identities, are coming from different organizations, different expectations, and different organizational cultures, right? Just different in many ways. We're learning, we're growing, we're stretching, we're going to make mistakes, all of those things. That relationship-based, intercultural, and collaborative work, it really requires some self-reflection and some humility around how we show up, right? Being able to kind of decenter ourselves and our immediate kind of emotional reactions to things and say, why did that happen like that? Why did that go really well? Why did that not feel right? What did, when I was in this space, when I was in that coalition meeting, right? When we were working on this, this project charter together, what would I do again, right? What about my behavior or the way I was there do I feel really proud of? Where do I feel like I didn't really nail it and I should do something different next time, right? Or I could learn something. Were there any spots where I really messed up and what do I do about that? And how do I make repair, right? So we really need to take the time to think about this. It's not automatic. It's not just you came out of a concrete deliverable and it worked or it didn't, or people showed up or they didn't, right? It really requires all along the way that we're thinking about how are we showing up to make the relationship and the ongoing collaboration happen in a way that's effective. That just takes some time to think. We have to spend some time doing reflection. And there's a lot of research from the education world that shows that self-reflection makes an enormous difference in our performance, right? You can find documented evidence that this is not just a fuzzy, let's all sit around and think about things. It concretely, measurably makes a difference in your work. It improves your performance if you take time to really think about, how you did and how you want to be next time. This is also really important because I've said before that no two community-led projects are the same, right? Every community is unique, every project is unique, every moment in time is different, right? The combination of people and project and time always different. So because of that, our process has to adapt each time. We're not going to follow the same exact set of rigid steps every time. So we really need to be thinking, right? To be thinking about what's happening, what's progressing, what was the original plan? Is that plan still the right one? What needs to shift, right? So we have to take that time. So reflection is what helps us understand why things are successful. Like sometimes we emphasize learning from failure a lot, but we forget about learning from success. We're just like, well, that worked, so I don't have to think about it anymore, right? Like, hooray, next thing. Why did it work? What about it works that you can replicate or that you can bring to other situations? So thinking about your successes, thinking about where you'd like to improve, and thinking about what you're going to do next. Right? So this is essential, just making some time and some space for reflection. And this really should not just be ad hoc, like, oh, I'll just find some time. Like thinking doesn't take, I think all day, like I'll just think about it. It's really important to actually carve out some space and some time for this, or it doesn't really happen in a deep way. So one of the clearest things you can do is build it into your schedule. Like manage, if you're a manager, you know, support your staff in this, like encourage your staff to block out time. Don't overload them so that they're unable to block out time, right? Like make sure that this is something that they're supported in doing. For each of us, like make an appointment in your calendar, right? Or like however it is that you would treat like a thing that has to happen, that has a set time, do that for your reflection work. Otherwise, it's so easy for that to be the thing that you just like, oh, that conversation went 15 minutes long, and I really could use a few minutes to prep for my next meeting. And this email just came in asking for this thing a week earlier than I thought, right? Like that, if you're not intentional about that time, it evaporates so fast, so fast. You can also think about how you want to reflect. So, you know, we all have kind of just naturally different ways of doing this. So maybe you're kind of an external processor, you're more of an extrovert, or you like to bounce things around out loud. Like, who's your processing buddy? Is this something you can do with your manager? If not, right, if for whatever reason you aren't feeling safe to do that with your manager, like who else can be your or maybe you just don't have enough access to your manager, your big system, you don't see them that often, you don't work in the same building a lot. Like who else can be your processing buddy, right? Like who can you have these conversations with where you can sort of help bounce things off each other? You know, someone who will listen and kind of prompt you to think for yourself rather than kind of giving you answers or suggestions. And that sort of coaching model. Maybe you're more of an internal processor, right? Maybe you're more of an introvert, or you like to write or draw to think through things. You know, is a journal the right solution for you? And I'll say that that's what I tend to do. I like to write out when I'm thinking through things. Like I just, even though I, you know, do all of my work online, I have a physical, you know, pen and piece of paper, and I've got a virtual background on, so you can't see my pen, but like it's very pretty. You know, I have like a pretty pen and a nice where I can like, you know, I can actually write out my thoughts. Some people like to draw. It's also helpful to think about, you know, do you want open-ended reflection? Do you just want a blank piece of paper or some open time to talk with someone? Or do you like a little more structure? Like, would it help for you to think through, like to identify 3 or 4 questions, right, that you're going to ask yourself? Like, what was most successful? What did I learn from that I can apply in the future? What was least successful? What did I learn from that, right? Like, do you want to sort of give yourself a guided conversation or journal? You know, are you more open or more structured? Also consider the space where you're doing this. You want to have your reflection time in a space where you can concentrate and think deeply and not be constantly interrupted. This may not be your desk, right? Especially if you are not someone with an office, with a door. Like, you know, if you're sitting right next to like the buzzer that someone pushes every time the line gets too long at the desk, not a great space for reflection, right? So sometimes that's all we got, but is it possible to find or make a more restorative space? There's a scholar, Beck Tench, who writes about restorative space and has a library restorative space toolkit, so highly recommend their work. But even if it's not like a reflecting pool at the Japanese garden, it can just be like the meeting room, right? Like, just a place that's kind of away from your day-to-day, like away where you can just, you know, you don't have that to-do list running in the back of your mind because all your Post-it notes about the 75 other things you have to do are right in front of your face. right? So like if you gotta go lock yourself in a closet for a few minutes, you know, that's okay. But like think about space, right? If you're in a library or in a position where a little bit of offsite work is possible, this can be something that's really good to do in that space. Although home is a little like your desk, right? Like maybe it's a good place and maybe you're like, oh, that pile of laundry is still sitting there. So, you know, find a restorative space for yourself. And then in terms of reflection, you know, welcoming new ideas comes up here as well, right? Like that you want to be open. You want to be open to feedback. Sometimes what you're going to be reflecting on is feedback from others, right? Not just your own observations about what's working or what's not, but someone being like, hey, I just want you to know that you said this thing and it really didn't land very well, right? Or, hey, I want you to know that, you know, you did this thing really quickly and it might have seemed like a small thing to you, but it was actually really important to me, right? So integrating that feedback from others as well. All right, next one, developing interpersonal skills and cultural humility, right? So community-led work is all about building relationships with and being in spaces created and led by people with all kinds of identities, backgrounds, and lived experiences. And ideally, they're different from yours. So more than any particular technical skill or knowledge, what we really need from staff here is interpersonal skills and the ability to decenter ourselves in our worldview, right? To like have some cultural humility to say the way I do things, it's just the way I do things, right? There's no value judgment attached to that. It's not better or more professional because it's my assumption, right, about how we should communicate or how organizations should work. Just being like, there are a lot of different possible ways to do this. It's kind of arbitrary. What I really need to do is understand what other people, right, the people that I'm trying to build relationships with, what their norms are, what they care about, you know, how they want to work, and kind of getting myself and my own biases out of the way. I will say that this is pretty different from how we used to hire library staff, right? Like we were not always organizations that were recruiting for people skills, basically. And so this can be challenging, right? And it can also mean a divide sometimes between newer and more experienced staff, where like maybe new staff are hired with that expectation, and older staff were not hired with that expectation, and their work didn't look like that for the first 15 years, right, that they worked in the library, and it's a big shift. So there's both the hiring piece and there's the training and development piece. So in the hiring piece, we want to make these interpersonal and cultural skills a big piece of the hiring process, like make them a competency. Ask questions about them specifically. You really want to be looking for, right, people skills over book skills, right, in a lot of public-facing positions. For the folks who already have on staff, offer, if you're a manager, or just take, if you're an individual, training, right, on these topics. So if you're a manager, make as much of this available to your staff as you can. If you're an individual, just like look for this kind of stuff, right? Training doesn't need to focus always on, you know, hard or technical skills. Like this soft skill training is really valuable. So look for those opportunities. Be open to feedback, right? We learn from what people tell us. So giving feedback is an act of trust, right? If someone says to you like, ouch, you know, I want you to know that the way that you said that, or this action that you took was hurtful to me and had a negative impact on me, even if you didn't mean it, right? It's not about your intention. It's about your impact. So that person is really trusting you when they tell you that. Like that's a vulnerable moment to say something like that, to kind of initiate conflict with someone, to tell them something negative about themselves. That's hard. And they're trusting you that like you're not going to blow up in their face, right? And that you're actually going to hear them. Like if they thought you were just irredeemable, they wouldn't bother, right? So they're really putting a lot of trust in you, and you need to earn it, right? You should deserve it. Don't get defensive. Don't start like focusing on like, but what I meant was, right? Just be open, listen, and focus on improving your impact on others. And this is a lot of what you can do with your reflection time, right? Is you're sharpening your intercultural and interpersonal skills. All right, so let's take 5 minutes and discuss these. So reflecting and personal and intercultural skills. how do you take time and space to reflect now? What could you do to make this more of a normal part of your life? What topics, like training and professional development topics related to interpersonal skills or cultural competence, would be most helpful for you, and where might you get them? Hint, Gels probably is like already offering them, because every time I come up with an idea like, hey, we should learn more about this, they're like, oh, we did that 2 weeks ago. We got that. Or can you think of an example of when your assumptions about what it means to be professional or to communicate or to collaborate were challenged? Like what biases or unspoken norms might exist in your cultural background that you might need to decenter when working with others? That's like a 3-hour conversation, and we're going to take 5 minutes. So sorry about that, but you know, just to get us thinking about these things. Wonderful. I got to eavesdrop on some great conversations. If you have any reflections that you want to share, please pop them in the chat so that others can enjoy them. All right, the last 2 steps in this phase, connect prior experience. This one comes back a little bit to growth mindset. But when I talked with librarians who were doing this work really well, and they pretty much, with really only one exception, were like, I didn't know what I was doing, right? I didn't know how to do this. One of the things that was really helpful to them was the ability to make connections with prior experiences from different contexts. So chances are, even if you've never done community-led work in a library setting before, that you have skills and knowledge from other experiences that are going to really help you. And it can increase your confidence a lot and sort of give you, help you understand what strengths you have to build on and kind of what you can ground your work in. If you're able to identify some of those things. So pretty simple. I talked to folks in my research who were like, well, I was an RA in a dorm, and, from working with like the kids who were living in my, on my floor, like, I developed these skills and I learned these things. So really the only strategy here is just like, think about your experiences, but think about a time that you participated in a team or in a collaborative experience, especially if you were in some way different from a lot of the other participants, right? If you had a different cultural background or a different identity, or you were new in town, right? And this could be in another job, right? It could be in another, like at another library. It could be from a time you worked in a totally different industry, like, from like a little side job you had in high school or college or a previous career, but it also doesn't have to be from work at all, right? You develop these kinds of skills, right? When you're on a committee in your faith community, when you volunteer, right? When you help plan a family reunion. You can't think of anything that takes more interpersonal skill than that, right? Or you plan your high school reunion. Like there are so many times and places in your life where you work with other people to get something done, right? All of those skills, all of those experiences, all of the knowledge that you built, that's all valid. That's all helping you here. That's all part of what you bring. Yeah, okay, we see in the chat, right? Teaching my aunts to use a Google form, right? Yeah. So take some time and think about those experiences and think about them as valid, right? Like what skills did you develop that can help you now, and how might you apply them? And this is one of those things that's like, it can be easier to do with each other than alone, right? Because like thinking about like, well, what am I good at? So many of us are prone and conditioned, right? To be like, oh, well, that's not really a big deal. I didn't really gather all that, I'm not that good at whatever. So this can be helpful to do in groups or in pairs, but, discuss with other people. Like, what are some of those experiences? And then you can sort of tell them, right? Like, it looks like you really developed this skill, right? It seems like you're really good at that. We can help each other see our strengths. And the last piece in this phase is build community knowledge through relationships. When we go to learn about our communities, right, knowing and understanding our communities is really essential to community-led work, right? It's a lot of the basis of community-led work. And sometimes when we talk about like knowledge about our community or community analysis, like we really focus on demographics and statistics, right? But what we really need to know often, we need to know those things, right? We want to know if there's been a large influx of a specific population, like from a group of immigrants from another country that's growing really fast, and we're not offering anything yet in their language, right? Like we need to know that kind of thing. Understanding demographics is important. And it's just one tiny part of the story. What we really need to know is people's hopes, their aspirations, their dreams, their fears, their values. We need to understand the relationships they have with each other, right? Where they're connected, where they're disconnected. You can't look that up on the internet. The census cannot tell this to you. The only way you can get this kind of knowledge is through relationships. So we have this kind of, we just are in a society that has this very westernized kind of colonial framework about what epistemology, right? Like what kind of information counts as knowledge and what kind of knowledge is valid. So we tend to focus on data, right? Like measurable numerical things. And okay, like relationships maybe have a tiny bit of bearing on that because like you might learn a fact, right, from your relationship. But when we're engaged in relational ways of knowing, the relationships are really the valid form of knowledge, right? And data is just a piece within that. So what does that look like in practice? It means having community conversations about people's aspirations, right? Not about the library necessarily or what they want from the library, but just about what they care about, what they value, what work they're doing, and what things they're trying to accomplish in the world right now. You can do that in like formal kind of focus groupy style things. You can have these conversations with people one-on-one. They can be formal interviews. They can be informal, like taking people out to coffee a couple times a year. Right? You can just hang out where people gather, right? Especially in communities that you aren't reaching effectively now. Like they're somewhere. Where are they? Right? Join their organization, their grassroots coalition. Help plan community cultural celebrations, right? You don't have to lead as a library. It doesn't have to be your program that you start. Find things that are happening in the community and participate. Making things together, right? When you engage in community-led planning, when you actually have a project that you work on together, you're building deep knowledge about people as well, right? You're building relationships and knowledge. If you're not sure where to start, a tool you can use is called community asset mapping or community network mapping, which is a way of identifying who's in your community and the relationships between them. And based on the expressions I'm seeing from Ashley and Kim right now, you either already have a webinar about that or you have one coming up. Yes, so put that in the chat. Awesome, thank you. So some things to think about because we're at time. Some things to think about are what your prior experiences are that have helped you build skills that you might use in community-led planning. Like what are the strengths that you have that maybe you don't even know about yet? And what are some strategies that you can use to build community knowledge through relationships, especially what you can do regularly versus what requires a special project, right? There's like, okay, we're doing a strategic plan and we're going to have this big formal process, but also like, what can you do on a Tuesday, right? To help deepen your relationships and your knowledge of community. So the 6 steps we went over today: foster a growth mindset, develop psychological safety for a culture of inclusion and innovation, make time for reflection, hire and train for interpersonal skills and cultural humility, connect your prior experiences, and build community knowledge through relationships. This is not fast work. And I heard that in some of the breakout discussions. Like this stuff takes time. It takes time. It takes consistency, right? It's like the first time that you admit a mistake in public as a manager is not going to suddenly change everyone's behavior, right? So just recognizing these are slow, they're time consuming, they're iterative, and you don't see the benefit all at once, or not everyone reacts in the same way all at the same time. Next time we will talk about operational changes. So like what are the specific concrete changes you can make in your day-to-day work that will help you, that will allow you to make the shifts that enable you to act on a lot of these deep cultural shifts that you've made. So in the chat, as we close out, if you're able to stick around for a minute, just pop in the chat something from today that felt particularly important or meaningful to you, or a question that you're grappling with that you'd like us to answer next time. Thank you very much. And please remember to fill out the survey. As people are signing off, I'll just read off some of those reflections. Yeah, providing time for myself and staff to reflect. Fostering a growth mindset. Thank you all.
We've got a few more that came in. It's okay to fail, understanding the need to fail. Focusing on
Focusing on
concepts.
concepts rather than procedures.
I love all this learning.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes, thank you,
And
everyone.
thank you, Audrey.
Sign
Thank
up for the next
you.
one.
See you again soon.